What happens when a cocky billionaire mocks an aging Hollywood icon, unaware that the man he's insulting is also a gifted painter? "I don't paint," the mogul chuckled, swirling his drink as he faced Sylvester Stallone. "Then I suggest you stop judging art so quickly," Stallone replied, calm but unreadable. What none of them expected was that one of the evening's most coveted paintings, bought for 6 figures, would be signed with a name they'd never heard, yet belonged to the very man they underestimated. A story of arrogance, humility, and revelation that would leave the room silent and the lesson unforgettable. It was one of those perfectly polished spring evenings in New York, where the last gold of sunlight bounced off marble buildings and mingled with the buzz of the city, just as the elite began arriving at the Frick Collection. Fifth Avenue glittered with town cars and limousines pulling up to the historic museum turned private venue. Inside, the annual Brush Strokes for Bravery charity gala was already underway, an opulent art auction held for the benefit of veterans' rehabilitation programs. There were whispers of 7-figure donations and talk of acquisitions and philanthropy, all under the guise of wine, canapes, and a cultivated appreciation for the arts. Moving quietly through the crowd was a man who had once been one of the most recognized faces on Earth. Sylvester Stallone, in a dark, perfectly tailored suit and soft gray scarf, looked more like a writer or professor than the icon of American action cinema. Unlike most of the guests, he wasn't here to be seen or to make deals. He had submitted a painting under a pseudonym, L. Stone, and came not to be recognized, but to see if the art could stand on its own. For Stallone, painting had always been a private world, a way of expressing what couldn't be said in scripts or fight scenes. It dated back to his youth, long before Hollywood fame or muscle-bound expectations. Near the back of the gallery, surrounded by a circle of admirers and acolytes, stood Gregory Langford, a self-made billionaire who'd built one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Mid-60s, salt and pepper hair combed with precision, and a diamond pin glinting at his lapel. Langford had a presence that filled a room before he even spoke. His money wasn't old, but it was loud. He had been chosen as this year's honorary patron, not for his taste, but for his donations, and his ability to be the center of any room he entered. Langford stood before one of the anonymous works up for auction, a moody oil painting of a lone man sitting beneath a flickering street lamp. The figure, shoulders hunched and hands wrapped in athletic tape, seemed to carry exhaustion and resolve in equal measure. The palette was muted, almost cinematic in its atmosphere. Langford gave a derisive snort, drawing the attention of those around him. "Well, if that isn't a still from Rocky," he said, swirling his bourbon. "A little too obvious, don't you think? Whoever painted this must think sweat equals soul. Probably someone who watched a few fight movies and figured they'd try something deep." There were low chuckles from the surrounding circle, bankers, lawyers, a hedge fund executive or two. "Looks like a failed storyboard, not a piece of real art," one of them added. Langford's voice carried just enough for nearby guests to overhear. "They're letting just about anyone paint these days. I bet someone like Stallone would call this profound." As if summoned, Stallone was standing just a few feet away, quietly examining a landscape piece. He didn't react at first, but when Langford turned and saw him, the billionaire's eyebrows lifted in recognition and amusement. "Well, speak of the devil," Langford said with a wide grin. "Sly Stallone in an art gallery. Didn't expect to see you at an event like this. What's the matter? No Hollywood gala tonight?" Stallone turned slightly and offered a polite nod. "I'm just here for the cause," he said simply. Langford stepped closer, his drink still in hand, posture relaxed but voice tinged with mockery. "Sure, but you gotta admit, this crowd's a bit different from a movie set. Unless you're here to pick up a painting for your man cave?" "I like art," Stallone replied. "Always have." Langford chuckled. "No kidding? You ever try painting one of these things?" The grin grew broader, cockier. "I just don't see you with a brush in your hand. Maybe a barbell, maybe a bazooka, but not a brush." Stallone didn't flinch. "I've painted since I was a kid," he said evenly. "Long before the movies." Langford blinked, then let out a laugh. "You're kidding!" He gestured toward the moody painting again. "Let me guess, this one's yours?" More laughter. Stallone's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said calmly, "but it speaks to something." Langford waved a hand dismissively. "It speaks to melodrama. I mean, look at it. Brooding, bleeding, begging for sympathy. Might as well call it the underdog in oil." He turned away, already bored of the conversation. "If it goes cheap, maybe I'll buy it for the lounge at my Hamptons house. Put it next to the cigar humidor." Stallone stayed silent. He didn't have to say anything. He just let Langford laugh and move on, deeper into the crowd. As the night progressed and the champagne flowed more freely, the room grew louder, richer, more electric. The auction began with more traditional pieces, watercolors of Long Island harbors, abstract canvases in bright colors. Prices ranged from $10,000 to $50,000, depending more on the artist's name than the image. Then came the anonymous segment, 8 paintings, submitted without attribution, intended to let the work speak louder than the name behind it. Lot number 72 was the second to last, the painting under the street lamp. "Opening at $5,000, the auctioneer called. "Do I have 6? Hands shot up quickly. 8, 12, 20. Then from across the room, 35, Langford said, his voice unmistakable. 45, a younger bidder answered. Langford sipped his drink, smiling. 60. Whispers stirred. A pause. Someone tried 70. Langford raised a finger. 85. The room grew quiet. The gavel came down. "Sold to Mr. Gregory Langford." Scattered applause followed. Langford grinned at his table. "Guess I've got an eye after all." As the auctioneer moved to the final piece, she paused. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "several of our anonymous artists requested to remain unnamed, but one has allowed us to reveal their identity after the sale." She opened an envelope and smiled. "The artist behind Under the Lamp is Mr. Sylvester Stallone." There was a hush, then gasps, then heads turning like a wave in the room. Langford's face dropped. He turned slowly toward Stallone, who was still standing quietly near the far wall, expression unreadable. For a long moment, Langford said nothing. Then, with a forced chuckle, he stepped forward. "Well, you got me," he said, raising his glass. "You really got me." Stallone offered a small smile. "Didn't mean to. I just paint." "But why submit it anonymously?" Langford asked, still trying to regain control of the moment. Stallone looked at the painting. "Because I wanted to know if people would see it. Not me." Langford lowered his glass slightly, realizing, perhaps for the first time that night, what humility actually looked like. The room hadn't fully recovered from the revelation. Conversations that once hummed with wine-fueled ease had become fragmented and cautious. Eyes flicked toward Sylvester Stallone, not with the casual curiosity reserved for celebrities, but with a different kind of respect, tinged with guilt for some, curiosity for others, and in a few, something closer to awe. Meanwhile, Gregory Langford remained rooted near the auction floor, still holding his bourbon, his smile stiffening by the second. He was the type of man who didn't like being caught off guard, especially not in public. For someone who prided himself on being 3 steps ahead in every negotiation, every boardroom battle, tonight's misstep landed like a quiet slap in front of a very expensive audience. Eventually, he approached Stallone again, slower this time, as if weighing each step. "Listen," he began, voice lower, the bravado trimmed. "I didn't mean anything earlier. Just having fun, you know?" Stallone turned to face him, expression unreadable. "You're entitled to your opinion," he said calmly. The painting spoke for itself. Langford gave a tight nod, clearly not used to being the one seeking reconciliation. "I'll be honest, I never saw you as someone with that kind of depth. That piece, it got to me. That says something, right?" Stallone's eyes didn't leave his. "The painting didn't change," he said. "You did." With nothing more to add, Stallone offered a courteous nod and excused himself, drifting toward a quiet corner of the gallery. Langford remained behind, visibly off balance. Around them, the crowd resumed its motion, but the mood had shifted. A few guests who had ignored Stallone earlier now approached him with genuine interest. A woman who ran a non-profit for inner-city art programs thanked him for the inspiration. A young man from the Met asked almost sheepishly if Stallone would ever consider doing a solo show. Stallone received their kindness with humility, but kept his answers short. The truth was, he hadn't come to be the center of attention. He came to offer a piece of himself in silence. The moment had simply spoken louder than he expected. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the champagne flutes emptied, Stallone stepped outside into the cool air of Fifth Avenue. A light mist had begun to fall, softening the lights of passing cabs and storefronts. As he waited for his car, a voice called from behind. It was Langford again, this time without the bourbon, coat slung over his arm. "You really painted that, huh?" he asked, as if needing to hear it again. Stallone gave a small nod. "Every brush stroke." Langford exhaled. "You know, I used to sketch when I was younger. Never told anyone that. My old man said it was a waste of time. Said I should learn spreadsheets, not watercolors." There was a pause. "I haven't picked up a pencil since I was 16. Stallone looked at him softer now. "Maybe it's time to try again." Langford chuckled, a sad sound. "Maybe, but I wouldn't hang it at the Frick." "You don't need to," Stallone replied. "You just need to hang it somewhere you'll see it." The car arrived, and Stallone slid inside with a nod. The door shut with a quiet finality, leaving Langford on the curb, watching the taillights disappear into the city's mist. In the weeks that followed, word of Stallone's anonymous painting spread far beyond the walls of the Frick collection. Art blogs picked up the story first, some skeptical, some stunned. "From the ring to the easel," one headline read. "Sly's hidden stroke of genius," said another. It wasn't just the novelty of the story that caught attention. It was the painting itself. Photographs from the gala revealed the emotional gravity of the piece, and soon it became a symbol not just of surprise, but of the untapped potential that lives quietly inside people, waiting to be seen. Requests came in for interviews, gallery showings, even collaborations. Stallone turned down most of them. He wasn't interested in becoming a public spectacle in the art world. He just wanted to paint. But one call he couldn't ignore came from a familiar number, his old friend and fellow artist, Howard Levin, who ran a veteran arts center in Brooklyn. "I saw the news," Howard said over the phone. "Your painting. Sly. It knocked the wind out of me." Stallone was quiet. "It was meant to honor them, guys like you." Howard chuckled. "You did more than honor us. You gave us a voice. Listen, I've got an idea. We're opening a new wing at the center, focused on healing through visual arts. We've got veterans painting through trauma, grief, addiction. We want to name the new exhibit after you, but only if you'll let us hang your piece there permanently." Stallone didn't answer immediately. He thought about the quiet man under the street lamp in his painting, about the pain he'd captured, and the resilience that followed. "Only if it hangs there without my name," he finally said. "Let the art speak." The dedication ceremony was small, quiet, and far from the opulence of the Manhattan Gala. No champagne towers or tuxedos, just veterans, families, and a handful of local reporters. The gallery walls were lined with raw, powerful art. Scenes of war, recovery, silence, hope. And there, in the center, hung Stallone's painting. No plaque, no signature, just a quiet label, donated anonymously by a friend. But there was one guest who did recognize it. Gregory Langford, dressed this time in a wool overcoat and scarf, arrived unannounced, hands buried in his pockets. He moved slowly through the center, pausing at each painting, saying nothing. When he reached Stallone's piece, he stood for a long time, longer than the others. Stallone approached quietly, watching him from the side. Langford spoke without turning. "I see it differently now. Here, it feels heavier, realer." Stallone nodded. "It always was." Langford glanced over. "I gave it back, you know, the painting. Told the foundation to auction it again or place it where it could matter more." He shrugged. "Didn't feel right keeping it in my house, like I hadn't earned it." Stallone looked at him, then at the painting. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," Langford replied, "because somewhere along the way, I forgot that some things are made to be seen, not owned." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by walls that echoed with stories of survival, pain, and quiet triumph. This was no longer about money or status or names. It was about expression, healing, and the invisible threads that connect people when words no longer suffice. That night, Stallone didn't return to his usual studio. Instead, he took a long walk through the streets of Brooklyn, stopping to sketch a series of quick portraits of the people he passed. A mother with her son, a tired man with a guitar case, a boy watching his reflection in a subway window. In each face, he saw the same quiet strength he'd once painted under a street lamp. It was all around, always had been. It just took a little silence for people to hear it. Weeks turned into months, and while the buzz from that spring gala eventually faded from the headlines, its echoes continued in quiet places. The kind where true change often takes root. At the Brooklyn Veteran Arts Center, where Stallone's painting now quietly hung without fanfare or signature, visitors came not for spectacle, but for connection. Men who hadn't spoken in group therapy found themselves staring at the canvas, their eyes lingering not just on the image of the exhausted fighter beneath the lamp, but on what it didn't say, the silence between the brushstrokes. In that stillness, something stirred. Stallone continued painting, but now more intentionally, not to impress, not to distract from the persona the world had assigned him, but to speak directly to people who needed to be reminded that their scars weren't the end of their story. He began to spend more time at the center, offering not lessons, but presence. He would sit in the back of a workshop with a cup of coffee, sketching quietly while veterans worked on their own pieces, occasionally offering a word, a nod, or a story from a time long before the red carpets and action scenes. One afternoon, Howard Levin called him into the office with a familiar blend of excitement and apprehension in his voice. "There's someone you should meet," he said, motioning toward the small meeting room off the hallway. Waiting inside was a woman in her late 30s, with clipped hair and a steady gaze. "This is Madison Grant," Howard introduced. "She's curating an exhibit at the Smithsonian next year on American resilience in modern art. She heard about what we're doing here, and more importantly, about your piece." Madison extended her hand. "Mr. Stallone, I've followed your acting career, of course, but when I saw photographs of your painting, I was moved in a way I didn't expect. I had to come see it in person." Stallone offered a modest handshake. "Glad it meant something to you." Madison sat forward. "It did. And I'd like to ask you to consider something. We're building an exhibit titled American Grit, Stories in Canvas. It's about transformation, endurance, and the power of personal expression, especially from those whose voices are often overlooked. We want your painting, but not just the piece. We want the story, too." Stallone was quiet for a moment. "The painting's already found its place," he said. "Here, with the people it was made for." Madison nodded. "I understand, but it could live in both places. We're not asking to take it forever. A traveling showcase. 1 year. Then it comes back." She paused. "Art can do something in those halls. It can speak louder than news or speeches. And I think this piece has something to say." He didn't respond right away. That night, Stallone returned to the center alone. The lights in the gallery were dimmed for the evening, but he knew the layout well enough to walk through without assistance. He stood in front of his painting, the same one that had once been auctioned for spectacle, then returned in humility, now requested again, not as a novelty, but as a voice. He thought about the man in the painting, about himself, about the years that hardened his frame and thickened his skin, about the loneliness that no amount of applause could fix. The spotlight had faded before, and it would again, but the art remained. Real, still, and somehow more alive than ever. In the months that followed, Stallone agreed to the proposal. The painting would travel with the exhibit, making stops in Los Angeles, Chicago, Austin, and finally Washington, D.C. Each city brought new audiences: veterans, students, young artists, aging couples who remembered Stallone as a cinematic hero, but now saw something else, something deeper. In Chicago, a boy of 16 stood staring at the painting for nearly half an hour. When a docent finally asked if he was okay, the boy only said, "He looks like my dad did when he left." In Austin, a woman left a letter taped to the display, addressed only to L. Stone, thanking the artist for showing her husband, an Iraq vet who had given up painting, what healing looked like. Meanwhile, back in New York, Stallone's life took on a new rhythm. He no longer moved in and out of parties and interviews. Instead, his days were quieter, paint-stained mornings in the studio, afternoons spent mentoring young veterans, and evenings walking the Brooklyn streets that now felt more like home than Hollywood ever did. One of the veterans, a soft-spoken Marine named Eli, approached him during a workshop and said, "You know what that painting did for me? It made me feel seen, like the fight didn't make me ugly." Stallone swallowed hard, then patted his shoulder. "The fight never makes you ugly. The hiding does." Near the end of the exhibit's run, a private reception was held at the Smithsonian, not open to the public or press, but to those who had contributed to the collection and those whose stories it reflected. The painting had been given a place of quiet honor, lit gently, with no gold frame or flashy description, just the title and the artist's chosen pseudonym, L. Stone. Gregory Langford was there too, invited at Stallone's request. He wore a subdued navy suit and stayed mostly to himself, observing the crowd with a different energy than he once had. As he approached the painting, he caught Stallone standing nearby. Their eyes met, and for once, no words were necessary. Langford looked at the canvas for a long moment, then turned and said, "I've started sketching again. Nothing serious, but something." Stallone nodded. "That's enough." By the time the painting returned home to Brooklyn, its reputation had transformed, but to Stallone, it remained the same quiet thing it had always been. A moment captured, a man beneath a lamp, a weight too heavy for words, but just light enough to be painted. He never added his signature. When asked why, in an interview years later, he smiled and said, "Because it's not about who painted it. It's about who sees it and what they see in themselves." That winter, the gallery at the Veterans Center added a new section called Brushes of Strength, featuring works from dozens of men and women who'd passed through the workshops over the years. None were famous. Most had never painted before the center. But their pieces, much like the one that started it all, carried depth that couldn't be taught. Stallone's painting hung there still, not behind velvet ropes, but at eye level, where anyone could stand before it, see themselves reflected in its shadows, and feel, if only for a moment, understood. And for the first time in a long time, Sylvester Stallone felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not pride, not victory, but peace. And maybe that was the real masterpiece all along.